What we have witnessed over these decades is the rot going very deep, but a system developing in which the UN and so-called human rights organizations are actually at the core of this battle against Western civilization.
Today is Wednesday, February 11th. This is Boundless Insights, and I'm Aviva Klumpus. In courtrooms and councils around the world, a new front in the war against Israel is being fought. Not with rockets or rifles, but with indictments and inquiries. From ICC arrest warrants to ICJ hearings and UN commissions of inquiry, Israel is under siege in international legal forums. These actions aren't merely symbolic. They shape global opinion, restrict Israel's freedom to defend itself, and hand strategic victories to terror groups. The law, once meant to serve as a shield for justice, is increasingly being used as a weapon. To talk about the weaponization of international law, I'm joined today by Natasha Hausdorff, Legal Director of UK Lawyers for Israel. Natasha clerked for Chief Justice Miriam Naor at Israel's Supreme Court and now leads some of the toughest legal battles on Israel and anti-Semitism in the international arena. There's a lot to cover, so let's get into it. Natasha, welcome to Boundless Insights.
Aviva, it's my absolute pleasure to be here with you.
I'm actually honored because you've been one of the most outspoken and one of the most important voices to emerge over the course of this war. But as I was reading your bio and background, I've learned that you've actually got a long history and a distinguished history working on this international battle for Israel's legitimacy.
Yeah, unfortunately, I've been doing this a long time because this battle has been waging for decades. And now so many more people can't ignore it. I hope that we're going to be in a better position collectively to fight it.
Me too. I'd love to go back in time. You had the distinction of clerking for Chief Justice Miriam Naor at Israel's Supreme Court. And I wonder if there is a story from that period or a lesson from that time that shapes how you see Israel's fight for legitimacy today.
One of my major takeaways, because of my role in that particular office for the Chief Justice, I was somewhat involved with relationships with other Supreme Courts, and in particular the UK Supreme Court, because in the course of my time at the court, we had an exchange, a visit of the Israeli judges to the UK. And that was essentially jointly hosted by Baroness Brenda Hale, who was at the time the head of the Supreme Court in the United Kingdom, and Miriam Naor as the Chief Justice of the Israeli Supreme Court. And I could see that there was a relatively close personal relationship between many of the judges. They'd been on previous visits. There existed, if you will, information sharing, experience sharing. And I can imagine it's a pretty lonely place to be when you are at the very top of your judicial career. Actually having those relationships with judges in other jurisdictions can be extremely helpful. How have you grappled with this, constitutional problem before, and the like. But I was particularly interested to see that the closeness of that personal relationship ultimately didn't translate at all into the public arena, where Brenda Hale has been at the forefront of many of the major attacks on Israel in the political arena. And I think that was very instructive to me, seeing that evolution across that 10-year period, as to how the personal might not necessarily cut through the political agenda that we are ultimately having to grapple with.
I saw something very similar at the United Nations, where I was the speechwriter for Israel's delegation, where in the back corridors, out of the way of prying eyes and cameras, there'd be lots of conversations between members of the Israeli delegation and countries that don't have open relations or peace deals. But once the cameras are rolling, once the mics are hot and the speeches are being given, it's a whole different story.
All that's out of the window, and they're off the anti-Israel hymn sheet, just as...
That's exactly right. Knee-jerk reaction. You're now the legal director of UK Lawyers for Israel, and now you're on the front lines of some of the toughest cases about Israel and anti-Semitism. So how did you find yourself in this role? And can you just give us an overview of the types of issues your team is confronting at the moment?
So I joined UK Lawyers for Israel as a volunteer about 10 years ago, a little over that. And over that past decade, in that voluntary role, we have taken on everything from helping students on campus, confronting anti-Israel activity or discrimination from professors, or sometimes even the very top leadership of universities, to dealing with BDS resolutions at local authority level, also the BDS legislation at national level, to, in the latter years, very much more from my own personal focus on international law, international courts and tribunals like the ICC, the ICJ, and increasingly the United Nations. I was there speaking to the UN Human Rights Council and calling out the weaponization of international law by despots, bigots, dictatorships, and terrorist organizations that rely on these institutions to propagate those sorts of falsehoods. So that's a very broad gambit. We also do a lot with sporting organizations, and in a context where Israel is being threatened with being excluded from football associations, all sorts of sporting associations, and of course also the European Song Contest. Eurovision, exactly. In all of those arenas, law actually plays a very significant role, because the vast majority of these organizations have non-discrimination provisions baked into their constitutions. And so what UK Lawyers for Israel has, I'd say, relatively uniquely done is simply worked to apply the law to Israel, to Israelis, to combating anti-Semitism, to apply existing legal frameworks and make sure that the law is upheld, also in an international context, and also to provide that kind of support to combating anti-Semitism and to educating. Because, of course, one of the key areas in which this battle is now playing out is in schools and universities and in the media, where there is this intense attempt to miseducate, diseducate, especially on matters where the law is at the very center of how the conflict is being discussed and how Israel's war with Hamas in Gaza is being portrayed. And so is my involvement with the charity side of this, the UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust, which I've more recently become legal director of. That focus really is on combating the weaponization of international law and educating as to the appropriate application of international law in all of these contexts.
Can you spell out the ways in which you've seen an evolution of international law being weaponized against Israel over the past decade?
It goes back a lot longer than that, but I can certainly tell you that there are certain points in time where the tension between rule of law countries and non-rule of law countries has really played out in a way which is just impossible to miss. One of these perhaps dates back from the 1970s, and it was the drafting of Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, which is a prime example of that exact battle between rule of law countries like the UK, the US, Israel, European states, that view law as a curtailment on government power, as against non-rule of law countries, despots and dictatorships, that view law as a means of wielding power. And the negotiations over Additional Protocol 1 in particular are instructive in that these unsavory characters, these despots, dictatorships, those countries that do not wish to embrace Western liberal values were very strongly advocating for protections for, their terrorist proxies and seeking to bake that into international law. But I think it's very important to recognize that international law is a strange beast. It's very unlike domestic legal systems. And ultimately, it does rely, for the most part, on states' consent to being bound, either through treaties, international conventions, or through an acceptance of state practice to the extent that it becomes what we call customary international law. States can object, and if they're consistently objecting to a rule of customary international law, it won't bind them. And that state consent is critical because it means that international law cannot be manipulated in the way that these non-rule of law countries are seeking to manipulate, weaponize, and otherwise abuse international law. And in fact, we need to be a lot more robust at pushing back on those attempts, both from a state level, so those rule of law countries need to be more proactive, I would suggest, in fighting for the preservation of real international law, but also on that educational front, calling out these malpractices at the United Nations or in the international media or amongst certain countries and international politicians and diplomats who should know better. We need to be educating more on these issues and calling these misapplications of international law to account.
What I find so galling is the hypocrisy, because institutions like the United Nations, like the ICC, like the ICJ, all claim neutrality to be unbiased, but
Yeah.
they spend a disproportionate and inordinate amount of time investigating and castigating Israel. So, my question for you is, do you see these bodies as irredeemable, as outdated institutions that can't be saved?
I'm afraid I do. And I say that with a very heavy heart. And I think it's even worse than you've just outlined. Because what we have witnessed over these decades is the rot going very deep, but a system developing in which the UN and so called human rights organizations are actually at the core of this battle against Western civilization. And I say that because if you look at what some of these NGOs have been putting out, and I'll give you one example. I was debating Amnesty International and their report alleging genocide against Israel. And I debated their representatives in Copenhagen and in Oslo. And I called out the methodology of this report as part of our exchange, which made it perfectly clear that these organizations did not have representatives on the ground in Gaza. They relied on what they called local government authorities.
That's a long way of saying Hamas. Yeah.
Hamas. And to be fair to the two representatives that I was debating, neither of them, I think, had actually read the report in very much detail and were perhaps unaware of where much of the information that they'd put into a document and headed up Amnesty International, where much of that information had come from. But this is a very well oiled process now that organizations like this will put out Hamas propaganda, will serve as a mouthpiece for it. That will be picked up by the UN Human Rights Council, its commissions, its special rapporteurs, and they will simply parrot the information that these so-called human rights organizations have parroted from Hamas. That will in turn be picked up by courts and tribunals like the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, and once that cycle is complete, these NGOs that initially put out that false information will cite the ICC referencing their original Hamas
Right.
material.
They are the source and they're essentially pointing to themselves, right?
So that cyclical process of, I think I called it out at the UN as a disinformation laundering facility. The UN has become the most prolific example of that. And that, to my mind, makes it irredeemable. I mean, if it's possible at some point, perhaps with an American administration that is particularly minded to seek to reform an institution like the United Nations, some form of congressional inquiry, root and branch, to analyze, what are the problems at the UN and what aspects of it might be worth saving. I think there'd be some merit in that. But ultimately, absent a process of that sort of detailed review, I can't see how the UN as a whole, in light of its complicity with terrorism and its continual obsessional focus on the Jewish state, how that can, in fact, be ultimately redeemed.
I had to smile a little bit as you asked whether a US administration would question the merits of the UN against what's irredeemable. But I think that this current president might just be looking at the UN in Manhattan and thinking that is a big, beautiful piece of riverside real estate, and we could turn it into something much better and kick the UN out altogether. You mentioned in the course of your answer something that I think people must ask you all the time, and it's probably the number one thing that people are wondering is how do we reply to claims of war crimes or genocide or ethnic cleansing or starvation? You sort of pointed to, well, what's the source? Is the source a terrorist organization? But when you're asked that question, how do you respond?
Ultimately, it depends on the context, Aviva, and I fully appreciate that one fool may throw a stone into a well and 10 wise men may struggle to remove it. And the real difficulty here is that these empty slogans and blood libels have to be addressed with detail, facts, accuracy, and a proper application of international law, and that takes time. And it's not the sort of thing most people have the bandwidth for. But I would encourage your listeners simply to ask questions in the first instance. For example, when someone accuses Israel of breaking international law, perhaps they can start by asking them, which law? Because invariably, I think you'll find that Israel's detractors will struggle to point to one. The problem here, though, is that much of this allegation of war crimes, genocide even, is fueled by falsified facts, by Hamas casualty figures, by allegations of disproportionality, which is in fact something that inverts both the facts and the law here. And I say that because proportionality in international law is a concept of weighing up the anticipated civilian collateral damage against the anticipated military advantage of a strike. It's always a balancing exercise, and there is a given, a very unfortunate given, but a given nonetheless, that in war, civilians will die. It's a context to which that calculation applies that is, of course, alien to most people who've thankfully never been visited by armed conflict or the sorts of decisions that Israeli soldiers and commanders are having to make on a daily basis to avoid civilian casualties, to preserve life wherever possible, to conduct that balancing exercise, to provide warnings of strikes, and to ensure that civilians are able to evacuate wherever possible. So all of that gives us the overall picture, which is that actually Israel is doing far more than any other army in the history of warfare to prevent civilian casualties and to precisely target Hamas terrorists in an unprecedented context where they have not just used civilians as human shields, but in fact human sacrifices as part of their military strategy. They are seeking to generate as many civilian casualties as possible. So in that sea of misinformation, I appreciate it's difficult to know where to start, but some of those corrections go an awful long way to highlighting the misinformation that these false allegations are predicated on. And if we just take a step back, I think it's really important to see how and why these false allegations have been so successful. And it's because they tap into this deep-seated psychology behind anti-Semitism. This notion of anti-Semitism as an evolving, mutating virus. The ancient blood libel may have been that Christian children were killed by Jews for their blood to be used in religious ritual. But today it's that the state of Israel is targeting children, and that is just as false. These blood libels of occupation, ethnic cleansing, colonialism, apartheid, genocide, they are all palpably false, inverted terms, and they happen to be legal terms. All of them. And this goes to the center of the abuse of international law and the misuse of these terms. And the reason I think that this is extremely important, not just for people who care about Israel and the future of the Jewish state and the Jewish people, but I think for people who care about Western civilization, is because the abuse of all of this terminology renders it meaningless. It means that it's going to be so much harder to call real perpetrators of war crimes, of human rights violations, of violations of the law of armed conflict, to call those real perpetrators to account in future, because these terms have been so denigrated and so abused and have ultimately been rendered meaningless because they've been so inverted as part of this anti-Semitic propaganda exercise.
You very elegantly spelled out the threat to the West. You've spoken about how the weaponization of law against Israel impacts public opinion. It fuels media outrage and sort of the narrative war that's going on. From a practical perspective, does it also impact Israel's ability to defend itself on the battlefield?
100%. I've heard that from people on the ground who are more familiar with, the military's ability to conduct the necessary warfare, where the 7th of October can never happen again. That has necessarily been impeded. We know that Israel is the stronger party here. Its ability to actually conduct armed conflict that is required, that any other country would be permitted to conduct in this context, in what is ultimately an existential war that Israel has been fighting on 7 fronts. That is necessarily impeded by these false narratives and by the abuse of these legal phrases. Israeli soldiers are now encountering situations around the world where if they travel, they are being threatened with arrest for trumped up charges. That is ultimately going to impact also, and this is another sort of second reason to include, going to impact on the ability of these individual soldiers to feel able to confidently carry out the missions that they have been given to target Hamas terrorists in this context. But there's also the broader issue, which is that this international rhetoric and the political decisions of so-called allies of the State of Israel, including what we've seen recently of recognizing a non-existent state of Palestine, that has necessarily encouraged Hamas. And I think it's incumbent upon us to realize that Israel's kinetic battles are inextricably linked to the media, information, international law arena and to the battles that need to be fought there. And that Israel ultimately cannot defend itself properly while these falsehoods, these blood libels are being parroted by not just the international media, but increasingly the politicians and leaders of states that Israel, until recently, did count amongst its allies.
You're reminding me of one of my favorite quotes from a different Chief Justice of Israel's Supreme Court, Aaron Barak, who said that very often a democracy has to fight with one hand tied behind its back, and even so the democracy has the upper hand. But maybe not in light of everything that we've seen now.
I would say at the time that Barak said those words, and it was in relation to, the legal oversight that the Supreme Court has in an unprecedented fashion when one considers similar situations around the world, the legal oversight that the court has on a lot of the military activity that Israel engages in. That was at a time when Israel was still permitted to fight with one hand. I think there are many that would say that over the last 2 years, there have certainly been occasions where Israel was fighting with both hands tied behind its back.
And possibly both legs.
And possibly both legs. And so that has been reflective of the seismic shift that we have seen and the immense tsunami of misinformation that we have been encountering.
You mentioned one of the byproducts of that misinformation campaign, and we have seen a wave of countries recognize a Palestinian state. And some people say it's just symbolic. What's the harm? So from a legal perspective, what does the recognition mean or not mean?
From a legal perspective, frankly, it doesn't mean anything at all because you cannot recognize a state into existence which doesn't exist as a state. It doesn't comply with the recognized criteria for statehood. Very importantly, there is no defined territory before we even get into the question of whether there's a government, a permanent population, or capacity to enter into international relations, given the divided nature of Hamas in the Gaza Strip and Fatah, or the PLO, in the West Bank. So on a strict reading, it doesn't have any impact, any legal impact. It doesn't create a state out of nothing. But it does actually do a great deal of damage to the existing international legal framework. The Oslo Accords, which were recognized and endorsed by many of those states that have now made these bizarre and unfounded political declarations supposedly recognizing a Palestinian state. The Oslo Accords have ultimately been thrown out of the window because the question of borders was one that was left for final status negotiations, and there was not to be any sense of, putting the cart before the horse, of there being any unilateral actions by the Palestinians on this front. But it's also, I would argue, from a legal perspective, a very serious attack on Israeli sovereign territory when one considers that the real status of this territory, the disputed territory, from 1948 under universally applied international law and the rule of uti possidetis juris, when one considers that the status of that territory has been that it's Israeli sovereign territory and that has never changed, subject to those final status negotiations, those lines have never been redrawn. What the UK, Canada, France, and others have ultimately done is attack that Israeli sovereign territory and suggest that it is of a different legal nature. Again, it can't change anything on the ground, but it is a significant step in throwing out of the window recognized international law and recognized international agreements. And that spells really bad news, I would suggest, for international law and international legal organizations also.
Natasha, you just make me so very, very grateful that you're fighting on our side. Thank you so much for everything that you do, and thank you for joining us today.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, Aviva.
That's a wrap on today's episode of Boundless Insights. This show is produced by Yochai Meital and Alma Ben-Zev. Whether you've been with us from the start or are just discovering our show, we are so glad you're here. If today's conversation sparked a question, challenged your thinking, or made you nod vigorously, I want to hear from you. Email me at podcast@boundlessisrael.org. Your feedback gives us ideas for new topics and new guests. And if you believe these conversations matter, there are 3 easy ways to support the show. First, follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. Second, help us spread the word. Share an episode with friends and family, post about it, or mention it in a group chat. It really does make a difference. And third, consider supporting our work. Boundless is a nonprofit, and we rely on donors like you. You can make a gift at boundlessisrael.org/donate. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep the conversation going.